Howdy folks, welcome back to Boondockery. Today my video is going to be focusing on sharps. That's all my bushcrafting tools that can cut. Now I don't know if any of you can relate to this, but I started thinking about it, and over the past 40 plus years I've assembled quite a huge assortment of cutting devices. Whether or not those are knives, they're saws, they're axes, hatchets, machetes, you name it. I've assembled this huge collection without any intent to collect. And it really is staggering the number of these things that I have. And I was talking with my wife the other day, and I was trying to think of what my next video is going to be. And she says, well, you haven't done a video on your sharps. This is like, why don't you do a video about that? And I'm like, brilliant, I'll do it. And so I went out to the Bushcraft laboratory, aka my garage, and started sorting through the bins of my tools. And I would, quite frankly, I'm embarrassed that I've assembled so many. And you know, I've given so much of it away. I just, I didn't think that I had that much left, but apparently I do. What I'm going to do today is I am not going to be doing a review. I'm going to pretty much do a show and tell of a lot of the cutting devices, the sharps that I have and use, and tell you a little bit about them, and then take that in categories. First of all, I'm going to do knives, I'm going to do saws, I'm going to do multi-tools, and then I'm going to touch upon the big stuff like axes, machetes, entrenching tools, and things like that. And pretty much I'll give you my 2 cents worth on a couple of the things I have. And I would venture to say a lot of you have a lot of the same items. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get this show on the road. Before I start showing off my sharps, I just wanted to throw something out there, and that is I am not a knife snob. I don't buy a knife because it's made by a particular person because they're awesome, they're amazing, the artist that manufactures them is world-renowned or anything else like that. I buy a tool to use the tool, and I do use the tool, and I don't abuse the tool, but I use it, and as a result they're in rough shape. I'll be perfectly honest with you. And by nature of where I store my knives, which is in my Bushcraft laboratory, aka my garage, I live in a very high humidity environment. And over the course of the year, sometimes some of my blades will develop a little surface rust. So, once a year I pull all of them out, I wipe them down. If there's any surface rust, I sort of wipe it away with a 3M Scotch-Brite pad, and I oil them down, put them back to, to the next year. And a lot of times, because I have so many, they wind up staying in that container for the year. And my wife and I was watching some YouTube videos the other day on bushcrafting, and I started noticing a trend in the different videos I was watching, and that the knives that some of these YouTubers are using are absolutely pristine. They're gorgeous, they're beautiful works of art, but they're flawless. There's no blemish whatsoever on the blade, on the handle, on the finish, anything. And I'm like, how do you use a tool in an outdoors environment and maintain that pristine, beautiful finish? It boggled my mind. And so the reason I'm bringing this up is that you're gonna be tempted to judge me. You're gonna be tempted to judge me because a lot of my knives, I mean, they're worn because they're well used. I just wanted to throw that out there just keep that in mind. You know, the one of the haters out there say, oh my gosh, I can't believe you let your knives get in that condition, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, when it all gets down to it, it is what it is. The first batch of knives I'm going to show you is just sort of a potpourri of different little knives I saw in one of my bins. And I said, yeah, oh yeah, I remember that. It's just, and all of them sort of have like a brief little story behind them, and just a little something that sort of stands out as far as why I purchased it to begin with, and or why I received it. And I just thought I'd share those starting off with, and then I'll get into more of my actual work tools. First, we'll start off with this Gerber Parabellum. When I was in the United States Army, I was able to purchase Gerber knives at a fantastic price through our main PX. And at the time, Gerber was a little pricey, but they were good quality blades at the time. At the time, they were made completely in the United States. And when I got out, you know, that's where my mind was as far as the manufacturers that I would pretty much look for. And then this little jewel came out. It's called the Gerber Parabellum, and I have it in its fixed blade configuration, but it's actually a folder. And the sheath design was pretty neat in that you could either wear it as a belt sheath, or you could open it up and use it as if it's a fixed blade knife. And that also affords you the main pouch to where you could put a multi-tool. So I used this for years and years before I ever got into reenacting or ever even thought about something called bushcrafting. And a little while after that, a friend of mine, her husband had passed away, and she was going through some items and found this Air Force survival knife. And this looked a little different. It looked a good bit older than a lot of the ones I have seen. And the thing that really struck me was just how razor sharp this thing was. And I have never sharpened this. I've only put oil on it, things like that. I store it. But this thing was, I mean, I could shave with that. It was insane how sharp it was. It's just a basic Ontario Air Force survival knife. And on the pommel, it says Ontario and 10-76. I don't know if that's the date it was manufactured. I do know that the individual that owned this was a Korean War, Vietnam War veteran, and he actually started off in the U.S. Army Air Corps before it turned into the United States Air Force. And it's just a tool that I've not used, but if I choose to do so, it's going to definitely do a fantastic job. I could easily use this as a hunting knife. It's so sharp. And it also has a whetstone in the sheath. You know, this is about as non-impressive as you can get. When I first started historical reenacting, didn't have a whole lot of money after purchasing muskets and all this other stuff. So with my first knife, it turned out to be, I think this is Ontario Knife Company as well, but I also used old hickories. And I made a sheath, and this wound up being the reenacting knives that I used for years before I actually ever purchased a historically accurate one. It definitely did the job I needed it to do for everything. And a lot of people would never consider this to be a bushcrafting tool. However, I mean, depending on what you want to use it for, something that you can pick up from a flea market, an antique shop, something like that, secondhand store, things like that. If it's got a good carbon steel blade on it, it's definitely worthy of using in the woods. Now, this is the first bushcrafting knife I ever bought. It's a Mora. And it's got a carbon steel blade, and I've let the blade brown out, and so that's the reason for the dark coloring. And I bought this in a oh golly, I think it was the Army surplus store in Cambridge that me and my buddy Jamie Booth went to when I visited him in England. And it came with this plastic sheath, as a lot of them do, and to practice my bushcraft skills and to continue on with the tradition that I had when I was in reenacting. I made a nice little bushcrafting sheath, fits in there very, very well, as a little brass ring, so I can wear that on my belt. And it did the job very, very well for a good long time. And then I eventually moved onto something a little more robust, which I have batoned with this and everything else, and it's still maintained all of its integrity. Even though it's a partial tang, the tang only comes to about right here on it, it's still an excellent knife, especially if you're just starting off into bushcrafting, camping, things like that. This is actually an amazing knife to get because it's very affordable, they're very plentiful. And so if anything ever happens, you know, you wind up breaking the blade or things like that, it's easily replaced. And it's also just a great tool for beginners to learn basic knife handling and things like that. This has an interesting story. I went to the second Pathfinder gathering that Dave Canterbury hosted at Rocky Fork State Park. And I met him, I talked with him, and he found out that I did a lot of documentaries for the History Channel. I was heavily involved in historical reenactment and things like that. And he asked me to come back to the next year's gathering to do a presentation on primitive skills in reenacting. So I did that, and the last night that I was there, Dave gave me this knife. This was one of the last knives of this style. This was a knife that he had commissioned for, I believe it's Brothers of Bushcraft, or Tops Knives, excuse me, Tops Knives manufactured this for him. And this was in probably the last case that he had before they all sold out. And he gave that to me as a thank you for doing the presentation for him. I just thought that was interesting, a little tidbit to share. And because, you know, it has sentimental value and things like that, this is one I've not actually used. Another thing is every once in a while you run into some interesting tools when you're at these different trade fairs, bushcrafting shows and things like that. And I ran across this cold steel knife. This is another one that I've not yet used, but the reason I purchased it is the fact that it is super, super versatile. You can put it on a pike pole, a staff, and use it as a spear, a short staff. You can actually use this as an extended handled machete or something like that. That comes with a little ferro rod. I just thought that that was pretty nice. And cold steel makes some pretty good quality blades. This one right here is one of their budget things. So if you would like to get something, and when you're first starting out with bushcrafting, wild camping, things like this, for heavy duty camp chores, you couldn't go wrong with something like this. And it's very high quality, maintains an edge very well. Everything I've ever seen on YouTube or read about it, it's just a real workhorse and super, super simple. And so if something like this, you could really use it for rugged work and really abuse this, because it's super cheap, it's easy to replace if you do actually wind up damaging it, and you have the versatility of doing a whole lot of other things with it. As time went by, I saw a lot of different knives that people were using. And a buddy of mine, Jamie Booth, same guy I visited in England, he purchased an ESEE 6. And I looked at that thing, I was like, my gosh, you could cut a tree down with that thing. And I started looking at it, and I thought it was just a little bit big for me. And I investigated the website, found out that they have a whole bunch of different kinds of knives, different lengths, different sizes, different styles, different designs. And so I decided on 2 for my first purchase. Well, it didn't stop at 2. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to show off several of my ESEE knives. Now the first two ESEEs that I wound up purchasing, the first one of which was the ESEE5. And the ESEE5 afforded to me what I believed to be a good length to do things like batoning, things like that. But the extra length of the ESEE6 I thought was just a little much. And the knife itself is absolutely robust. I mean, it's super durable, has a fantastic powder coat finish, and the handles, the scales are actually fairly comfortable. When I first got it, I was like, wow, those are sort of boxy. And even though I have felt and handled knives that have a better grip as far as the comfort factor goes, these have done very well for me. They're very comfortable. Some interesting features of this is, I know a lot of people don't like this, but there's some knurling on the back of the blade for when you're doing, you know, small detail work. You can actually get a little purchase on there, which is sort of nice. It also has a divot on the handle that you can use for friction fires, bow drills. It has a nice little lanyard hole and a nice little glass breaking end for the pommel. It's a full tang, and it's skeletonized. The tang is skeletonized on the inside, so you can use a hex key to remove the scales if you wanted or needed to use this as a spear tip. And I thought that everything involved with the design of this was absolutely fantastic. And the best thing about this for me is their unconditional, no questions asked return policy. If I were to put this in a vise and hook a D-ring or hook a tow cable to this portion of the pommel and pull it away to where the blade would snap, I could send these two pieces back to the manufacturer. They'd send me a new knife. Of course, that would take some doing to break this thing. But from all the batoning, all the work I've done with this, the blade is absolutely fantastic. There's no dings, nicks, or anything else in it. So this has really turned out to be an outstanding workhorse for me. And the sheaths that came with it at the time were very versatile. It comes with a little kit, all different types of ways that you can attach different types of things to the sheath for different types of wearing. And I've played around with all kinds of things. This one here, I've designed this with some webbing so that I can wear it in the small of my back and to be able to pull it out with my right hand and be able to access it. That way it's out of my way when I'm bending over. You know, this doesn't stab me in the belly and things like that. Just a lot more comfortable. It's out of the way that way. And you can always add things to the exterior. You can add like a survival kit, things like that to it. And it's just a very versatile, very well thought out tool. The next one I bought them at the same time, was my ESEE Azula 2. My ESEE Azula 2 is the knife that I actually probably use more than any of the other knives that I own. It is just the perfect size to do just about anything. And the sheath is a friction sheath, and it just, you know, dangles. I wear it as a neck knife. I've got some 550 cord on there. I've got some 220 cord wrapped around it. And on the inside, let's see, get it in there, you can see that there's a sewing needle. And behind here, I have an emergency sewing kit, just in case, you know, I'd have a piece of webbing or something on one of my packs that went down. I could remove this 220 cord, take out the sewing kit, and be able to make any field repairs that I needed to. But this is absolutely a fantastic little knife. Definitely one that I use more than just about any of the other knives that I have, and I take it with me every time I go out. My next ESEE knife that I purchased is actually one that I leave on my sling bag, and the sheath stays in a sling bag. The knife actually goes into my bin with my other knives. And I've just decided this is my dedicated, I'm going kayaking, I load up my day's worth of stuff in here, and the knife is always there. It is the ESEE 4. And the SE4 is a little thinner, not quite as robust as the SE5, but it doesn't need to be. But this is probably far more practical for just about any of my bushcrafting uses that I would need. And it's made a lot of different similar features as a skeletonized tang. And again, you can remove the scales to be able to use it as a spear or any other type of device like that. And it's just sort of more or less a miniature version of the SE5. And again, I always keep it, whenever I go out, my kayaking, this is where it goes. And the last knife is one that took me back to my reenacting days. When I did finally wind up getting a decent reenacting knife that was period appropriate, it looked exactly like this. And unfortunately I lost that in the house fire, and so I no longer have it. But this is a classic trade knife shape from the 18th century. It is the ESEE 6HM, and this feels absolutely fantastic in my hand. And I've learned that once I purchased this, they have a whole line or whole series of knives that have this style of handle. This is probably the most comfortable handle on any knife that I own, and I absolutely love this. I use this primarily for batoning wood, things like that, heavy duty camp chores, and I'll bring this along. And the knife is amazing. I absolutely love this knife. The sheath, on the other hand, I hate the sheath. Absolutely hate the sheath. Even with my limited leather crafting skills, I could have done a much better sheath, a leather sheath, than this. It only came in black, which I would much prefer brown leather. And it's more like a holster than it is a sheath. And it holds in there fairly snug. It's fairly comfortable, but if you're into the, I guess, the more traditional bushcrafting thing, this right here would probably do you more than what it's very well made as far as the actual construction goes, heavy duty leather, things like that, but it's very, very basic, very basic. Now this knife actually comes with your choice of leather or kydex, and unfortunately when they manufactured mine, kydex was not an option, and they made these individually, so it wasn't to a standard template. So I could order a kydex sheath for this, but the company told me they would not be able to guarantee that the sheath would fit properly. All the ones that are manufactured today are manufactured to a set template. The scales are manufactured absolutely identically to one another, so there's no variance in them. I have been half tempted to go ahead and order one of the kydex sheaths and just see if I need to modify it in any way, shape, or form. Use a heat gun to soften up the kydex and to be able to just slide the knife in to where it fits properly, but I just haven't gotten around to it. But those are my ESEEs. Now the last knife I'm going to share with you is the Brothers of Bushcraft from Tops Knives. And this was actually a gift. It was given to me by Josh Booth and several years ago. And it has turned out to be the bushcrafting knife that I use the most. I take it out almost every single time I go. And the knife itself is absolutely fantastic. It's a little bit smaller than some of the other knives I have. It has a lot of the same features. I mean, there's little divots on either side here for bow drill, fire making, things like that. A lot of similarities to a couple of my ESEE knives, but it's super comfortable, which is, has a lot to do with why you want to use a particular knife. But one of the reasons excuse me, that I use this above any of my others is actually the sheath. The sheath is simple kydex. I have tensioning with these screws here, but the belt clip, which this will go through molly webbing, and that's where I have it on my Bushcraft patrol rig, swivels around so you can have it in any position. When it's on my hip and I bend down to do some work on the ground, it's out of my way. If I need to, I can set it sideways and it swivels all the way around, so it's never in an uncomfortable position while it's on my belt, whether it be my belt that I have on my trousers or on my Bushcraft patrol rig. And this is the best thought out designed sheath that I think I own. And that's a silly reason to have a knife as your primary tool, but being able to have a good tool that is inconvenient to use or to take with you is not a good tool. This is both an excellent tool, and the sheath makes it convenient and easy for you to be able to use it in all of the possible ways that you're going to need to use it. So thanks again, Josh, and it's much appreciated. And as you can see, it has been heavily used. Now I'm going to show you some of the saws that I've collected over the years. Now, believe it or not, when I first started bushcrafting, I was completely ignorant as to what was available out there as far as saws go. And the benefit to a saw is that as far as the expended energy goes, you actually get more bang for your buck with a saw for the types of wood I'll be processing for bushcrafting and wild camping than you do with an axe. And believe it or not, as long as you're using it properly, a saw will wind up being much safer in the long run, and the types of injuries that you could sustain out of a saw is much less severe than the injuries you could sustain from an axe. But when I first started bushcrafting, this is the type of saw that I used. It was a simple pruning saw, and this right here is not the one that I purchased years ago. This is one I purchased for my wife to do her gardening and things like that with. But this was it. This was what I started off with. And through the years, I decided that I was going to upgrade this, and I purchased a Fisker's pruning saw, which worked really well. I did a side-by-side comparison with a friend of mine's Baco Laplander, and that Baco Laplander did cut more efficiently, so I wound up purchasing one of those. And this is a real workhorse. The nice thing about it is you can buy replacement blades, different types of blades for these, and so if you do wind up damaging your blade, you can always replace it. It's very inexpensive, super lightweight, very compact, and does an amazing job for anything you'd want to do. Now, as a gift, I received this folding saw, which there's not even a brand on it. It's just probably something you could pick up at Ollie's, Odd Lots. You know, it's a generic saw, but even though almost all of the parts are plastic, it's actually an excellent saw, and it does an excellent job processing wood. So this right here probably cost maybe $7, whereas if the best price you're going to get for a Baco Laplander, I think I bought mine, the first one, for $14.99, which is a really good price. If you're just starting off, something like this or something like this, super inexpensive, and it works. It does well. If you want to get into fine minutiae of things as far as weight and actual cutting effectiveness, it's going to be a little heavier. These two weigh approximately the same, Yeah, you might not be able to cut through something quite as fast as you can a silky, but it's going to do the job that you need it to do. And so this right here is more than sufficient enough to be able to purchase for your first bushcrafting wild camping saw. And who knows, it might wind up being the one that you use forever. Now, my wonderful wife purchased me this silky saw for Christmas one year, and since she has, this has been the one saw that I take with me everywhere. It's a little heavier than the Baco, but as far as the amount of cutting teeth surface goes, you have a much longer row of teeth and much more effective teeth. The teeth on these, there's almost no comparison. This is the comparison in the teeth. The teeth are almost twice as deep on the silky as they are on the Baco. And even though I love my Baco, it does a fantastic job. I can probably cut through the same piece of wood twice as fast with my silky as I can my Baco. And the last saw I'm going to share with you is another gift that, to be perfectly honest with you, I've never used this. I've used one identical to it, belonged to a buddy of mine, and we actually cut through a fairly substantial log with it. This is a pseudo chainsaw saw blade, and there's 2 webbing straps, and you wrap this around your log from underneath or from the side, and you simply pull back and forth on these straps. And we were amazed on the size of logs that we could cut through as a team. By yourself, if you work out a lot, you have tremendous upper arm strength and endurance, something like this might be something that you would use regularly to process large wood. I like it. I think it's neat, but as far as the practicality of it, I'm not 100% on that. But it was on my kit. It was different, so I decided to share it with you. Next thing I want to share with you is my multi-tools. This is a Leatherman that I keep on that Bushcraft patrol rig all the time. Multi-tools are just that. They are tools that have a multitude of different types of blades, sort of like a Swiss Army knife, except much more robust. I think some of the Swiss Army knives have, I don't know, they're almost sort of novelties. And but a true multi-tool is going to be robust enough for you to be able to actually really use it for just about anything that you need to. Now, just about every multi-tool out there is going to have a lot of different features, things like that. I have a tendency to lean more toward a needle nose plier, and most all of them will have some type of a genuine cutting blade. This one has a very nice blade on it, and you know, Leatherman is robust, it's heavy duty, and you pay for it, but it will last the distance that you need it to. I have another Leatherman here. This one is much fancier. I don't use it quite as much, but it's definitely much more expensive than the regular one I have, and it has a multitude more features and different styles of blades. They're just a little fancier. They have locking mechanisms on them where my original one did not. I started off with this one. This was the first one that I used. It was a Gerber, and back when I purchased mine, they did not offer needle nose, so it was a square tip. And as far as all of the different blades and things like that go, they're all pretty standard. They you know, nothing really remarkable about them. but they really come in handy for a lot of different things. I've needed a screwdriver, Phillips head, things like that in the past. And these things, I mean, you can get multi-tools that are very inexpensive, and they're okay. They are okay. They do what you need it to do. This one was one that I had when I was in the Army. And this was before multi-tools like the Leatherman, things like that, were really all that popular. And I wound up using this quite a bit when I was in the Army. There's a hex key. There is 2 different sizes of awls, different sizes of screwdriver tips. There are Phillips head, things like that. And it's super, super basic, but it fulfilled a need. And it was very convenient to be able to have that tool when I was in the Army. And had they had something like this that I knew about anyway, I definitely would have bought that. But this one, it's the most basic Leatherman, and that's the one that I keep on my Bushcraft patrol rig all the time, and it gets used. Moving on up to the big stuff. Now this is a standard GI issue E-tool, entrenching tool. This is mega heavy duty. This particular one is 100% all metal. I think at one time the screw bolt was replaced with plastic. I'm not certain. There are a lot of copies of this E-tool that's manufactured. Some of them, I think Glock actually makes one, and the bulk of it is plastic. And with this tool, you might get away with a well-designed plastic handle E-tool, but this thing is almost bomb-proof. And one drawback to having a bomb-proof entrenching tool is that this thing is heavy. It is very heavy, but it definitely does the job. The other thing with this is that with all entrenching tools, the military style, they're small. They're just, I mean, you get some back pain when you have to use one of these. You're squatted down. So usually when I wind up using this, I'm taking a knee or kneeling down completely to be able to dig or to use this. This comes in pretty handy. I reserve this pretty much for my Jeep camping, things like that, car camping, things to where I would not have to necessarily transport this for any great distance, as it is heavy. And it's not enjoyable to take something that's this heavy unless you're planning on using it a lot. Even the pseudo rubber plastic carrying case for it, you know, is a little heavier than some of the other types of materials that they could have used. But again, it's robust. It was designed to be soldier proof. And if something's soldier proof, you know that it's very, very robust and very well made. Now, the entrenching tool I prefer to use is this 1942 World War II surplus entrenching tool. And everything about it is original. As a matter of fact, the webbing here is starting to dry rot just a little bit on the cover. And this was given to me by my Uncle Dave. And he got this from his dad that was in the Army Air Corps during World War II. And this was his. And like I said, the date's right here, US 1942. The design of this is very simple. Yes, it's not as compact as current issued entrenching tools, but it's fairly lightweight. I would say, if not half, 1/3 lighter than the E-tool. I would say probably half the weight. But the T-handle on this makes it very, very comfortable to use. It's small enough to be able to put on your backpack, and it's light enough to where it's not going to be that much of an issue. For the most part, if I need to dig a cat hole to go number 2, then I'll use my little folding trowel that I have in my essentials pack that I take with me all the time. And but if I'm going to be doing some camp chores, we're going to be digging out fire pits, things like that, maybe digging a long-term latrine or something like that, for like I did at my semi-permanent camp, then something like this is very practical. It's very worth taking along with you. If you are going to be setting your tarp or your tent up, you know, where it's going to be raining, you can use an e-tool to dig a trench and drainage so that you aren't going to be waking up in the middle of the night in your tent, floating in the water that's going to come in underneath your fly inside your tent. So something like this and those types of situations, I mean, it's well worth the wait, and it's very practical. And a lot of people that see me using this and say, hey, where'd you get that? And I tell them where I got it and how old it is, and they're like, I can't believe you're using that. And I'm at the point in my life now, if I can't use it, I don't want it. I just, if I can't use it for what it was designed to be used for, I don't want it. I don't want wall hangers. I don't want decorations. I don't want it to look like a sports bar or like a Cracker Barrel restaurant. I want things that I'm going to use, and if it gets to a point to where I no longer have a use for it, I'm going to find someone that does, and I'm going to give it to them. But anyway, this is the e-tools. Now we're moving on up to some big choppers. And the first one I'm going to show you is the smallest of my big choppers. And this is just a small belt axe. And this was from my reenacting days, and I discovered that this came in quite handy when I first started getting into bushcraft. And this is not for processing large firewood, but for smaller pieces, it was excellent. You have to keep in mind that during the 18th century, a saw blade was very expensive, and to have a tomahawk or a small belt axe was a lot more practical and a lot less expensive in the long run. And so during the 18th century, I would have been using this before I would ever consider purchasing saw blades to make my own buck saws with. And it served pretty well for a little while. But I went on a shopping spree, or not shopping spree, an expedition to find decent camp axe. And I came up pretty empty-handed. And the reason being is everyone that I bushcrafted with, wild camped with, all of them had Gransford Brooks axes of different sizes and shapes. And every single place that I contacted, or stores that I went to that normally sell them, they were never in stock, ever. I could have got a splitting maul or something like that, or something I didn't want from the same company, but I couldn't find like the bushcrafting and wild camping size axes from Gransford Brooks. As a matter of fact, I went to Smoky Mountain Knife Works on 3 separate occasions, and they have this huge area in this wall display for Gransford Brooks's axes, and it was always empty. They didn't even have display models for sale. So I just, I decided that, well, if by any chance I ever do see one in stock again, and I have the money, because they are not cheap, I'll buy it. And I know you're thinking, oh, there's all kinds of axes out there that are every bit as good as Gransford Brooks's. You don't have to buy one of those, things like that. And that is 100% correct. And the reason I didn't look at other brands, and I know there are a lot of very high quality axes out there, is the fact that as far as an axe goes, I wasn't a huge fan of the axe. A lot of different reasons in that. And but as far as I'm concerned, the effort and energy that I exert into processing firewood, which is pretty much what I'd be using it for, is much better done through a saw. So, and I've seen axe injuries, and they're never little. They're never little. They're big, requiring emergency room trips and things like that. So I just wanted, I sort of was put it out of my head. I just wasn't really going to, search too hard for it. And Gransford Brooks come knocking at my door. Not the company, but a friend of mine, the same guy that gave me my brother's a Bushcraft knife, Josh Booth. Well, for whatever reason, he was selling some of his bushcraft and wild camp items, and he had a Gransford Brooks small forest axe, and he sold it to me for $75. $75. Now granted, I mean, there's some small little dings in the blade, things like that, and so I mean, it's been used, but I don't think I could replace any part of this from Gransford Brooks for $75. I honestly have no idea how much these go for, but after making certain that he wanted to do that, and seeing that my budget at the time, I couldn't really afford to offer him any more than that, I went ahead and took him up on the deal. And I've wound up using this quite a bit in different outings, where I'm specifically felling trees and processing big firewood, and it's really come in handy. And I was happy with that. I rarely use this, but if I need it now, I have one. So then, lo and behold, someone contacts me. They have an extra Gransford Brooks axe that they didn't need anymore. They accumulated other axes that did the same job, or what have you. I forget the exact reason, but anyway, they wanted to sell me this. I don't remember what the exact style this is, but it is smaller than the small forest axe. And then I started thinking about it. I said, well, that right there is an incredibly practical size, and it was pristine. The blade was perfect, and I believe I spent $100 for this. And again, it's one of those things that opportunity knocks, you answer it. You open that door, and you take advantage of those types of things when you can. But this right here has wound up being used a good bit more than my small forest axe, simply because of the convenient size and weight. Both of the Gransford Brooks axes are phenomenal, and I'm very well aware that there's other manufacturers that make equal quality at half the price or less. But as far as big choppas go, this is what I own. Now, another type of big choppa falls into the category of large blades. This particular one was the actual machete that I used when I was in the Army. Comes with an Army issue rubber sheath. There's like ventilations all through it to keep moisture and stuff out. It has hooks on it to be able to hang on a pistol belt that we had at the time. Also on the sheath is a small, not the greatest thing in the world, but a small sharpening device that you can use to sharpen it with. And the way it's designed is to sharpen it as you're drawing the blade. You simply push it into the groove that's there and you pull it out and it sharpens. That's how it's supposed to be used. I'm certain there's other ways you can use it, but that's it. But I sort of feel the same way about machetes that I do with axes. You really need to have a purpose for this. If I was in a very tropical type of environment, or I have to go through really dense underbrush, something like this would make sense. However, if you do not know what you're doing with these and you are not paying attention and you are not practicing safe machete handling skills, you can cause grievous injury to yourself. And again, another emergency room trip, because with a big choppa comes big injuries. And I've had a couple. I've had a couple injuries, but years and years and years ago. And but fortunately, they weren't as severe as they could have been. I was very, very lucky. I was very blessed to not have the injuries occur that could have had. But this is something that I rarely ever use now. Matter of fact, it's probably been 8-10 years since I have actually used this, when I was using it to cut grapevines in my property that I own. And the next big choppa is a cousin to the machete, but is pretty much a modern version of an 18th century tool that I used when I reenacted. That was called a fascine knife, or a bill hook. Now, Fiskars makes this. I think they called it the brush chopper or the brush clearer when I bought it. And this wound up being a lot more practical than a machete. Now, this is my wife's. This is the ones that she uses for her gardening stuff, her landscaping, things like this. Comes in this monstrosity of a case to keep it safe, and you can hang it up. Mine, I made a nice little sheath that I can put on my belt, and I can just throw it in my pack, but it's riveted to where the blade's not going to come out. Let me show you the reasons why I think this is the berries. And the same reason I love the fascine knife when I did my reenacting. This hook enables you, when you're chopping saplings, grapevines, things like this, if you're using this properly, when you hit the vine, it's going to trap the vine in this hook. Whereas the machete, your sweet spot with the machete is basically from here to here. If you're using it up through here, you're not getting the energy that you need to really cut through things. So from here to here, that's your sweet spot. It's like the sweet spot on a baseball bat. You have one particular area that it's the most ideal to hit the baseball. You have the spot between here and here, which is the most ideal to have the maximum amount of energy to cut through that vine, sapling, or what have you. But what happens with this, if you don't get that sweet spot, it rolls off the end of the blade and will come back at you. The bill hook doesn't do that. It's the exact opposite. It traps that in there. So your sweet spot here on the bill hook, the fascine knife, is between here and here. So when you're cutting vines, things like that, small trees, branches, fantastic for taking branches off of trees that you're processing. This is fantastic. However, you still have all of this blade. The one thing I've noticed when I'm cutting vines or anything of the like where I need energy, my hand is back in this position. So when I'm trapping that vine or what have you in this spot, I have the maximum amount of energy. However, if I want to cut, I want to debark, I want to do something that requires a lot more attention and a lot more finesse, I can choke up on this, and to be able to use this section of the blade here to get that done. And so you're able to use this great big chopper to be able to do small detail tools. I can cut in notches and branches and stuff with this. All kinds of things that I can do with this that I can't do with this. Well, folks, I hope you enjoyed my little show and tell that I provided today of all my sharps. And I had a ball going through all this stuff, brought back a lot of really good memories for a lot of them, and reminded me that I have a lot of really great tools that I need to get out in the woods more often and use them. And like my brother's a bushcraft knife. I use it because of the convenience. And you know, when you have everything ready to go, it's already on the belt, all you got to do is throw it on. You don't think about going and getting other tools that you haven't used for a while and take them out and put some dirt time in on those. Now, this was nothing more than a show and tell, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed doing it. This is in no way, shape, or form supposed to be instructional as far as knife handling, axe handling, anything else goes, but I'm going to put in the description a couple links, and there's a YouTuber out there called, his channel's called the MCQ Bushcraft Archive. I'm going to link 2 of his videos that are probably 2 of the finest safety and skills videos I've ever seen on knives or axes. And if you are a novice to either knives and bushcraft or axes, I would highly recommend you watching it. And even if you feel that you're highly skilled and highly qualified in those areas, you might want to give it a gander. You might learn a couple little things that you hadn't learned before, or be reminded of some things that you did learn a while back, but you forgot about them because you just didn't use those particular skills. Well, folks, as always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.